Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks to all of you who are coming into the room, digitally speaking. We're thrilled to be with you for this conversation and a special topic webcast on data centers. At IWBI, we have a culture of curiosity, and one of the areas where we're really curious is around data centers and a potential role or value that IWBI might be able to offer in the broader conversation, in particular as it pertains to community connectivity, social sustainability, and the social license to operate. We started out planning for this webcast as an internal lunch and learn for our team. But when we started to get exposed to the incredible content that our speakers, Beth and Anthony, are going to present today, we thought that it would be really valuable and intriguing to open it up to the broader community. So here we are. A big thanks to our amazing workplace well-being director, Susan, who puts together these programs most often for just our teams. But especially thanks to Susan for flagging this as an opportunity to share with a broader audience and really to begin this conversation with you as our broader community. Really so excited for Beth and Anthony to share the work that they're doing, which really is at the very bleeding edge of the proliferation of data centers and how we can establish data centers that can give back to the community in more ways than one. So with that, let me hand it over to Susan. She's going to introduce you formally to our two speakers, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone, and welcome. And welcome to our speakers, Anthony Paul Seiler and Beth Rattner. Anthony is the Director of Global Strategy and Go-to-Market for Data Centers at Johnson Controls. He leads the enterprise strategy and go-to-market execution for one of the fastest growing sectors in the industry. With a background in enterprise strategy, market segmentation, and operational excellence, he has played a pivotal role in shaping Johnson Controls' global data center organization, implementing a segment P&L structure to drive growth, standardization, and customer-centric solutions at scale. Anthony's expertise spans go-to-market strategy, innovation, and cross-functional leadership with a track record of aligning commercial operations, field execution, and services to maximize shareholder value. His strategic vision has defined key market opportunities, enhanced global scalability, and positioned Johnson Controls for long-term growth. A graduate of California State University, Sacramento, Anthony also completed executive education in management and leadership development at Harvard Business School. Beyond his professional accomplishments, he is passionate about mentorship, innovation, and thought leadership, contributing insights that shape industry trends. In his personal life, Anthony enjoys reading, writing, traveling, and playing pickleball. He is deeply committed to his family partnership with his wife to raise our two daughters with character, purpose, and kindness. And Beth Rattner is Senior Director of Endeavour Impact at Endeavour, an infrastructure innovation company partnering across the AI ecosystem to scale technologies with real-world impact. Its integrated technology stack delivers faster, cleaner infrastructure for data, energy, materials, and water. By engineering these systems to work as a whole, Endeavour meets the high-density demands of next-generation computing while addressing climate challenges. Endeavour is building regenerative systems that empower local communities and generate global benefits. Beth leads the new impact team for all of Endeavour, a suite of companies committed to reimagining infrastructure as net positive. Their team is piloting a new nexus between industry and nature, starting with co-locating data centers, waste streams, and the creation of new materials that the planet actually recognizes. Prior to Endeavour, Beth was executive director for the Biomimicry Institute. The Institute's mission is to help solve humanity's biggest challenges through the adoption of biomimicry, nature-inspired innovation in education, culture, and industry. It brings the practice of bio-inspired design to hundreds of thousands of people a year through its education and entrepreneurship programs. Having worked in regenerative design since 2000, Beth helped co-found the Cradle to Cradle Products Innovation Institute, where she was also executive director. We are delighted that Beth and Anthony could join us today for this presentation and conversation about the potential for data centers to be sustainable. Thank you. I'm I'm going to pass it along to Anthony first to kick us off.
Outstanding. Thank you, Susan. And good morning, good afternoon. I think I saw someone from Italy already say hello, so good afternoon to you. Allow me to share my screen. And as I'm doing that, thank you for the generous introduction. As Susan said, my name's Anthony Seiler. I have the privilege of focus to lead the strategy and the go-to-market for data centers within Johnson Controls. And so, can everyone see my screen okay and hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Well, wonderful. Well, this is the fun stuff we get to do. That Beth and I get to do is really talking to all of you about something that's near and dear to both of our companies' hearts, and something we spend a tremendous amount of time not just implementing but also learning. And that's the sustainability of data centers and how can we build and design data centers. And so I think we have the opportunity to field Q&A at the end. Please put any questions you might have in the chat. And then, and anything we can't answer on this call, we can certainly follow up with either written responses and such. But again, very happy to be with you this morning. I live in California, and sustainability is big here, as well as it's rippling throughout the globe, especially within data centers. The interesting part is data centers are not inherently sustainable. However, through our design and our build of data centers, we have the opportunity to view them holistically, to look at site selection, to look at the power and electricity, to look at water, to look at carbon, to look at sound and acoustics, all the things that matter from a sustainability standpoint. And so we're excited to share a little bit about them today. But I always take a posture of learning and an open hand approach that we'll be better tomorrow than we were today. And hopefully we're better today than we were yesterday. And so with that, many of you probably know who Johnson Controls is, how we span the globe, and how we scale. But I think everyone on this call, for the most part, and for the most part throughout all the people I work with, utilize the cloud, utilize AI, a portion of it, utilize streaming services or connected services at work. The very fact that we're on Zoom doing this presentation across the globe just shows us we are interconnected. And that infrastructure is very real. It's very physical. And the physicality of it are data centers. And data centers are sprinkled all throughout the globe, following power and fiber and water. And that connection of our serviceability, the scale, the growth, and what we do at Johnson Controls, as you look at these dots of a globe, the connection between our service and sustainability is great, because conditions are very local. Conditions vary. The expectations vary by region. Saudi Arabia is very different than the Netherlands when you think about cooling. The grid mix, the climate, any sort of water availability, Phoenix versus Singapore, there's difference in water. There's labor codes and community expectations. And so a company like Johnson Controls that has the breadth and the scale to meet those needs, but also get ahead of those decisions so we can have a sustainability pulse on everything we do, has been a very, very rewarding journey for us. And so I wanted to just share a little bit about where Johnson Controls is on the continuum of sustainability. It's been in our core DNA for 140 years. But as of last fall, we had our new CEO give the strategic pillars for our entire enterprise, 100,000 employees. And I thought you'd find them very interesting, because sustainability becomes, and still is, at the top of our priorities. The three pillars, as you can read from left to right, are decarbonizing human society, the future, enabling the future of AI in a sustainable ecosystem, and delivering mission critical environments where it really matters most. What I find interesting is data centers and sustainability actually arc over all three of these. Certainly within the first one for data centers, but data centers hinge and support many other mission critical environments. So when we think about healthcare, and when we think about pharmaceuticals or education or government, everything that they use has to be housed, stored, secured, powered, and cooled by data centers. And so every piece of this touches the sustainability aspect that we hold near and dear at not just in the present moment, but the innovation we're doing from a sustainability standpoint is truly remarkable to see where we'll be in the next few years. But obviously today we're talking about enabling the future of AI ecosystem. and that's data centers, primarily all data centers. And just to set the stage of the magnitude and the scale, we find ourselves in global installed capacity of about 122 gigawatts. So if you're not familiar with gigawatts, that can just seem kind of like a number with no real meaning. But to put that in perspective, that's more than all the electrical use in an entire year for the country of Japan. Tokyo, 23 wards of Tokyo, all the lights, all of Japan. So that's remarkable. But that's where we are today. What they're projected in the future for 2030 is another 100-ish gigawatts, which would take us to around 219 to 225 gigawatts of installed capacity. That's enough power to power 180 million homes. We only have 130 million homes in the US. So that just puts it in a little bit of perspective of where we are today, where we're going to be tomorrow, and really the next steps we need to be thinking about when it comes to grid, power, water, when it comes to carbon, sound. All of those variables matter drastically because we really can't afford data centers currently. I don't know how we're going to be able to make room for them with the growth trajectory of the future. This right here just gives you a real boots on the ground visual of what a data center build looks like. And when you think about, or if you read any headline news and they talk about gigafactories and a gigawatt data center and AI factories or training facilities, whatever that might be, this is what it looks like on the ground. And a gigawatt factory is about $50 to $55 billion in CapEx spend. It's about a 2 to 3 year build, now a little bit farther based on compliance and grid and utilities and such. But there is a tremendous amount of partners and contractors and consultants that are involved in something like this. With Johnson Controls, what we're able to do and what we've really shined in doing is getting upstream where the decisions and the site selection are made, and then talking about what grid strategy looks like. Are you utilizing utility? Are you behind the meter? Is it on-site power generation? What the cooling architecture actually looks like, and that we can hone for efficiency to drive more PUE towards the chip and towards compute. What water strategy based on site selection and geoclimate do you need? What heat rejection are you thinking about? The acoustics and the modularity components, all of which we are able to talk about upfront and really guide and hone the conversation. Because without a sustainability lens, if these decisions are wrong, they are extremely hard to fix later. They're extremely expensive, and the consequence to the globe, to the community, to the environment is not a good look for data centers. And so those are a lot of the things we're doing when it comes to upstream. If I go from a macro view and I just take a double click into now Johnson Controls within the data center organization that we have, what are we really doing and how are we doing it? There's a set of unique customer challenges that we are really positioned to solve. And each one of these has an arc of sustainability around it. Because when you think about the constant technical advancements of a customer challenge, they need power, they need water, they need cooling, they need all of these precious resources, and they're finite resources. So how can Johnson Controls look from an innovation standpoint to bring more availability and to do what you already do more efficiently? When we think about global sourcing and supply chain and service, there's so many things that are traveling around the world at one time. From Johnson Controls perspective, if we can limit that with our scalability and our breadth of the company and our branches and the employees that we have, what does that do from demands, the things that we have. So we're not reinventing the wheel in Frankfurt or Sao Paulo or Singapore or Tokyo like we would in Northern Virginia. It's all uniformity. It's all consistent. And what that does is it brings an additional sustainability layer back. So we're not recreating the wheel. There's no waste component to it. And we're being as streamlined as possible. And with that, innovation, scalability, and consistency, there's one more double click of our strategy that I really, really am excited to share with you all this morning. And it's a three-pronged approach, three-pillar approach, all of which have a lens of sustainability. When you think about optimizing the thermal performance, there's 16 to 18 different products that represent heat capture at a chip level through transfer, through rejection, and then ultimately reuse and recovery and reuse. If we're able to look at the power consumption and the efficiency in each of those, and we are able to make our technology more efficient within the cooling, we could take what once was 40% down to 32%, down to 15%, and then eventually maybe in the single digits, mid single digits, which would be incredible in a sense of not just saving power, saving electricity, but it's driving more power towards the compute, which is ultimately what we need to do in the data center. When we think about accelerating time to value, I had showed you that gigafactory that takes 2 to 3 years, and all the components it takes to actually have something implemented to that magnitude. What we're doing from a sustainability standpoint is we're looking at modular data centers. So when you think about a modular data center, there's very, very little waste. We're doing it in certain megawatts, the Lego blocks. Think of them like Lego blocks, where we're able to do everything from the power, the UPSs, the compute, the cooling, the fire, the security, all the environmental needs into a block system. And then we're able to deliver that to the site that may not have the skilled labor or may not have the power or may not have their gigawatt factory up and running yet. We're able to accelerate that time to value. And so from a customer's perspective, there's a dramatic acceleration between shovel to revenue, but from a sustainability standpoint, everything is contained into one modular data center, and it's all of our products, which means we have the opportunity from end to end to look at any sort of waste and recapture that. And then speaking of waste, the third pillar is unlocking stranded power. So what I mean by that is heat is an asset. And through every single one of those capture, transfer, rejection, reuse, there's possible vulnerabilities for heat to escape. And so we're able to utilize heat as an asset and capture that waste heat and then turn that into cooling. So we wouldn't be able, so the traditional cooling methodologies or traditional ways of doing that would not be as incumbent on the grid, and we wouldn't be using as much electricity. And so I'll talk a little bit about that technology. But these three pillars are near and dear, and it's the core strategy of what we do at Johnson Controls. And it's really exciting to see that each one of these, not just an arc of sustainability, but the details underpinning each one of these, we look at water, power, carbon, and sound for every single one of these. For anyone that has not walked through or meandered through a data hall or maybe even seen under the hood of one of them, this is what a typical one might look like. It's just spread out a little bit more. But when you look at the thermal chain or the thermal management, that's the heat capture from the chip, that's the heat transfer and the rejection component. The power management of it is simply distributing and managing that electrical power throughout the data center. And then when you think about operations and monitoring, this is where we see at Johnson Controls, obviously being a controls first company, this is where we see great opportunity as we're able to monitor and proactively monitor and manage that monitoring for greater use to look at waste, efficiency, a little bit of a feedback loop, and then create this flywheel that's the most efficient way of doing things. The IT infrastructure is simply the compute. So that's the high-powered compute that our chip manufacturers are producing and sending everywhere. And then there's the safety and environment perspective. These buildings are very real and very physical, some of which are in rural areas, some of which, but right up against cities and suburban areas. And so we need to take that into consideration from a sound, a look, aesthetics, and then everything that all the components of creating little microclimates because we're extracting heat. All of that goes into consideration when we think about a data center build. This here is just when I talk about heat capture, transfer, rejection, and reuse. Some of these products may look familiar. You may have seen these in certain headline news. You may have seen these in different company acquisitions. But the way I share this slide because I think it's a really helpful visual because it's hard to kind of in your mind visualize what these four components look like of capture, transfer, rejection, and then reuse. But if you just think about it, you have a chip, and that chip produces heat. It's generally on a cold plate, and there's a few ways to cool it. There's the air cooled way, and there's the liquid cooled way. Air cooled would just be, if you think about it, like literally just blowing air over it to take that heat, capture it, move it, transfer it, and then reject it into the ambient. And we've done that forever. With 6 to 9 kilowatt racks, that's been what we've done forever. But now we're talking about, in 5 months, 250 kilowatt racks. And then after that, talking about half a megawatt rack, be 500 kilowatts. So the way in which we need to cool now has to become more efficient, has to become more streamlined. And so you may have heard the term liquid cooling, which now is pretty amazing because there's different types of liquid cooling. There's single phase direct to chip. There's two-phase direct to chip, which actually creates a gas, so there's a phase change. And then there's an immersion component where you actually take the servers themselves, they have a little bit of a bag over it, and you dip them in that fluid to be as efficient as possible. And then there's single and two-phase of the immersion component. So it can get very, very granular at the lowest level, but the opportunity for us to increase efficiency at every single product type that we have in R&D is amazing, because just a little bit here and a little bit here over the course of 16 products creates tremendous efficiency in electrical for driving greater PUE for the customer, as well as less water, less sound, and less carbon. This slide here is just a simple way of saying, it's kind of a busy eye chart, but it's just a simple way of saying traditional air cooling, which once was upon a time, will still be around. It'll always be around because we have to cool the IT equipment with air. We can't actually put that in any fluid. But as we transition from single phase to two phase, and I mentioned there is a phase, there's a true phase change to that. So if you think about like a chip on a cold plate, and then you have little capillaries, think of that like the circulatory system of your body, your heart. And that capillary is bringing fluid. And there's water in the fluid on the technical loop side, and that's going right by the chip, and it's absorbing the heat, and then it goes right back, and it does it over and over again, and it creates the loop. However, with a single two-phase change, that liquid stays there long enough where it actually becomes a gas. And then we turn it back into water, and we do it again, rinse and repeat. But every single one of these phase changes creates a greater opportunity for efficiency. And the numbers are staggering, with not just current efficiency gains we're gaining, but also the things we're looking at exploratory wise, the things that are in R&D, the things that our engineers are researching and that we're actually testing. The opportunity to become much more efficient over the next few years of these builds is a great opportunity for not just Johnson Controls and the data center market, but also all of our customers and all of our community as this is scaling throughout the globe. I mentioned that there's going to be about 100 gigawatts of new power consumption, not just in traditional AI factories. There's the AI workload that you can see on the bottom right, but there's also the non-AI workload. That's going to be rising as well. And I mentioned, or kind of alluded, we can barely afford the data centers now, and there's a hardship on the grid now. How are we ever going to double our capacity? And so what happens is in order to transform to an AI-based economy, which is what a lot of researchers are saying, it requires significant peak power availability that we don't currently have now. So customers and operators have to get creative. And so there's things like wind and solar and turbines and fuel cells and tons of exploratory methods, nuclear power plants, putting them in space, putting them in the ocean, putting them anywhere. There's so many things that are being tossed around because we don't have the power to be able to do that. And so because of that, the delays in grid connection hinder the pace of AI deployment and infrastructure, which ultimately, from a consumer standpoint, hinders a lot of the business that you and I and others do on a daily basis. And so we just find ourselves in this tension of a moment as the race towards AGI and the race towards supercompute requires so much infrastructure and so much on the grid that we need to look at more sustainable ways to make this work. And so with that, I don't know if you've ever heard of absorption chillers, but Johnson Controls has been doing this for decades. Very big in the Navy. If you go on any cruise ships like the Royal Caribbean, they have them. But what we're thinking about and what we're utilizing them for is now data centers. And a traditional chiller, as you know, we use electricity, it blows cold air, it cools the chips, and we kind of rinse and repeat that way. The absorption chillers actually run off of heat. So it takes that heat and it converts it to cooling. So if you think about that just for a moment, I had mentioned that there's wasted heat at many turns throughout the thermal chain, and many times heat on behind like GPUs or district heating loops or on-site power generation. We're able to actually utilize our absorption technology to capture that wasted heat. So no longer is it wasted, no longer does it go to the ambient, and no longer does it create like super microclimates of where data centers are. But we're able to actually utilize that, repurpose it into cooling. And if you think about that, the traditional way we would use chillers goes down significantly, and the power usage effectiveness goes right back to the customer and it lowers. And so this is just a simple graph that shows you when you think about the components of consumption relative to IT power, chiller, dry coolers, cooling distribution units, and some other pieces. From an air cooled standpoint, from a water cooled standpoint versus an absorption standpoint, look at what it does from a PUE standpoint. And we're only getting better day by day, week by week, as we look to really innovate this industry. And so PUE is a really big metric that we measure, that data center operators measure. It's power usage effectiveness. And the way they compute it is it's the total facility energy divided by IT energy. So like, I guess theoretically, a perfect PUE would be 1.0, but a standard PUE would be about 1.4, 1.5 within the data center industry. So if we're able to utilize the efficiency from our technology to drive what once was 1.5 PUE to maybe 1.35, 1.2, it's an amazing opportunity when you think about the amount of power going through on a daily 24/7, 365 basis. So it's a really great opportunity for us. I wanted to share something else that we're doing recently. In case you haven't seen it in headline news, we have created reference design guides. And our reference design guides span a lot of our technology. We first did our water cooled chiller. We have our air cooled now. Absorption will be on the docket. And then we have many more that are planned. And this is just a simple way to show our customers as we get upstream in the first decision making of site selection and the cooling architecture and the grid connectivity and matrix, what we can do. So it's just a simple overview of our technology, what it does, how we're able to showcase that performance differentiation among not just our competitors, but for the community and for the globe and for the world, why this would matter from an efficiency or a sustainability standpoint and what we're able to do. And you'll notice that when you think about a gigawatt factory and the intended goals of what we're trying to achieve, maintaining our promise of sustainability is right on the list there. And so by leveraging not just the newest cooling technologies, but we're looking at everything and anything where it makes sense for us and our customers and the communities to look at all the water, all the power, all the carbon, and all the sound to be able to drive that and ultimately just be fiscally responsible with the finite resources that we have worldwide. And the last slide I have just talks about the acoustics and the technology leadership. So I mentioned that the buildings are very real, as you know, and some of them can butt up very closely to other communities, and they can be an eyesore. They can also be very loud, and they can give off little microclimates, which create heat. We take that very, very seriously. And so we actually partner with a few companies that look at the acoustics and different parts of our technology where we're actually able to build, develop, and manufacture these components that reduce noise significantly. And there's a lot of science that goes into it. I won't bore you with it all, but I just wanted to take that opportunity the last 25 minutes to share with you what Johnson Controls is doing from a sustainability standpoint, how near and dear it is to our company, to our customers, and ultimately to the globe, as we have the privilege of focus to scale with our customers globally, but also really hone their decision making towards sustainability. So, with that, Susan, I can pass it either back to you or I could volley it over to Beth, whichever you prefer.
Great. Yeah, I think Beth is going to put up her slides now. Thank you so much, Anthony. That was a really tremendous overview, really interesting. And yes, and thank you also for mentioning to everybody, feel free to put your questions into the chat or through Q&A, and we are going to do our best to answer them. After Beth's presentation, we'll have some time for Q&A. All right, thank you. Over to you, Beth.
Sure. Anthony, that was so good. And I just realized that if you all had our CEO or the head of technical sales presenting, it would be a much different presentation, but you are stuck with me. So I'm sorry about that. You're going to see a lot of flowers and trees and butterflies, very different. But it was so great. And Anthony teed up so many of really important topics. But as Susan said, I'm Beth. I'm the Senior Director for Impact over at Endeavour, which is a much smaller data center build company than Johnson Controls. But we have a slightly different mission, which is to think about things from the ecosystem perspective. Let me see if I can move this forward. There we go. So as you guys heard, my background is in biomimicry. I'm not an engineer. I don't come from a super technical background, although I did work at HP back in the day and was also thinking about things from the system perspective back then, but then made my way into the world of Cradle to Cradle and Biomimicry Institute. And there was one consistent theme, which is that nature operates in systems. And so we have this moment, Anthony spoke a little bit about the scale that we're facing, but this is also a $7 trillion moment. And for people who are interested in nature-based design and conservation and how we might rethink, this ability to redesign everything, when you have $7 trillion on the table, this is a moment to pay attention to. So that's my whole perspective for this presentation is what can we be thinking about that is a different moment than we typically usually have in the world of sustainability. If there is one true north, that nature-inspired design is the way that we can actually function the most effectively on this planet, maybe the way that we're going to ultimately thrive, which as someone who was at Biomimicry Institute for many years, like that's my true north. I really like to start all my presentations with planetary boundaries. Many of you have already heard about this. This is also reflected in Kate Rayworth's work of donut economics. But I think this is such an important grounding moment to just start with, because anything to me, if we're going to be building out $7 trillion worth of new infrastructure, then we have to be thinking about, well, what is the design assignment that we're trying to solve for? Everything should be solving for planetary boundaries at this point. And we've already transgressed 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries. And rather than talk in detail about each of them, if you're not familiar with the work of the Stockholm Resilience Center, I would encourage all of you to start there, because if we have this, like I said, this grand opportunity, let's not waste it on just trying to solve for one problem, but solve for multiple problems at once. So this is an infrastructure, a digital infrastructure moment, rethinking everything from energy to heat to water. So let's think about designing the infrastructure as a way to optimize the entire system. There's examples I like to pull from biomimicry all the time. This is the idea of the sponge city, which many of you in this particular audience would know about. Usually when I speak, most people have never heard of sponge cities, but you see this in China, you see this in the Netherlands. How do we actually integrate wetlands and places to sink water within an urban environment? In Atlanta during Hurricane Helene, I think it was just a couple of years ago, this one park was able to withstand something like 9 million gallons of water in a very much a flash flood event without any damage to the surrounding neighborhoods. So when we rethink infrastructure from the perspective of what would nature do, it changes the outcomes both economically and certainly from a social perspective. Same is true for cement. In the United States, there's probably 14,000 miles of concrete lining our coastlines. Same is true in other countries as well. It gets gross, it gets slimy, it ultimately decays. Company called eConcrete, which is a great biomimicry example, really has thought about it from this perspective of making this biologically active cement that acts like a coral reef. It gets stronger over time. It promotes marine life. The water gets cleaner, and it's beautiful. That's an example of how infrastructure can be beautiful. The same is true for actually our materials. This is another biomimicry example that I love to promote, because what does life look like from a manufacturing perspective if we don't use pigments and dyes, but we start to use light the same way that nature does? This is a company that's called Sparksel, which is actually manipulating cellulosic material to just reflect light and achieve a wide variety of color using cellulosic waste, like I said, and then getting to this place where we don't have to deal with all of the downstream effects. It's an infrastructure play, if you think about it that way from a materials perspective. I don't need to recap. Anthony did a great job of talking about this moment that we're in from a data center perspective, because that's, like I said, the question that's really in front of us, which is what do we do with this opportunity? The scale is phenomenal. I don't think I've ever, I mean, again, I don't come from an engineering background. I don't come from this like supreme technical perspective, but the dollars, the energy spend, the infrastructure that's going into this moment, whether you think of it as an existential threat to who will control the future of intellectual capital in the world, or this is a question of simply like what is the future of work, regardless, the scale is phenomenal. And so I just think it's, was it Churchill said, never let a crisis go. Uh, uh, Someone's going to type it in the chat. Don't waste a good crisis. The numbers from a labor, fiber, power generation perspective are, again, sort of astonishing. And if you think about this back from the planetary boundary perspective for a moment, think about all of these things as leverage points. That's the lens that we're approaching this with. Anthony talked about this as well. To me, it's really helpful to think about a gigawatt as 1 million homes, or like for those of us who grew up with Back to the Future, that's what it took to get the DeLorean to go back in time, was a gigawatt. So now you know. The way I like to think about this is there's really 3 elements to a new design assignment for data centers, which is number 1, can it restore soil? Can we accelerate this concept of waste equals food? And can we start to pivot to a biomaterials economy? We have to think about the fact that oil and gas has been massively subsidized on this planet for a number of decades now, and it informs everything that we have, both in our bodies and in our manufacturing system. So is there some creative way that we could be using data centers to pivot to that new biomaterials economy at the same time? So this is the broader lens that we've been approaching the question of data center build out with, which is different, like I said. And I apologize if you had the technical team, we would be talking more about that. I'll try to hit a little bit on those points as well, but mostly, like I said, I'm going to talk about plants. Soil restoration comes with so many benefits, as you all know. We are at a moment of huge community pushback to data centers. I think this is what Rachel was teeing up at the top of the conversation. What is the social license to operate? Why would you even want a data center in your backyard? And I think my supposition here is that you would have to make the surrounding area a lot more beautiful than it currently is if you were really going to be a welcomed neighbor. That is not something that most data center companies are asking right now. I want to focus on Texas because that's, as you'll see in a second, that's where a lot of the growth is happening. It's where some of the data centers that we're building are going in. This is what a drought map looks like from just the other day. About 50% of Texas, and this is coming right off the spring, is currently in drought. We know that the planet's getting hotter. We know that drought's getting worse, but this sector, this whole corridor, Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, that's where data centers are going in. So we have to be anticipating that we have to be making the area better than we found it. That's the fundamental systemic benefit. Texas is off the charts. It's second only, or I guess here it is. It's dwarfing Virginia, which has always been the leader in data center build out. So this is a moment for Texas specifically. This is what most data center builds look like. It's not particularly beautiful, and it's always, I mean, heat management, like we're going to talk about in just a second, but it's a very real concern. This is what Texas used to look like. So this is and for those of you who are familiar with the Land Institute, Wes Jackson's work, you'll hear a lot about this as well. In the prairie, grasslands used to sink carbon, sink water, etc. These massive long roots, taller than a human. If we the picture on the right is what the grasslands look like now in Texas. And that's a result of 300 years of very intense grazing. This is what we want to actually go back to. So this is like the question, the design assignment. If a data center went in, could we restore the prairie? Could we restore the woodlands? Could we actually start to sink water? Could we start to sink carbon into that same physical place? If we do that, and Texas was always historically a strong ag state as well, what is the amount of carbon we could be sinking at the same time? This is the site that we're going into in Central Texas. It's important to notice how barren the soil is. And this is coming again at the end of spring when it was probably the most vibrant. If you come at the end of summer, it's going to look worse than this. If you go to most places, the biodiversity would be about anywhere from 150 to 300 species in a given sort of measured space. The Blackland Prairie, which is where we are putting up these data centers, was much more abundant than that. It was probably closer to 500, 600 species. We just did a count because one of the things that we're doing when we go is to take a different kind of a baseline. What is the current carbon level of the soil? What is the current biodiversity in that place? We're down to 46 species. So again, we have inherited some pretty barren land at this point, and it makes for a good question around what is the new opportunity? Oops. Ah, sorry, my screen just stopped. We're going to go back and do it again. Sorry, you guys. How sad. Give me a second here. Hmm. Can we jump for a second to some questions while I like reopen up all my files, which somehow magically closed?
Yeah, we have had a couple that have rolled in. One is for Anthony. Do you expect AI adoption will slow down based on the speed of data center build?
I am not seeing that in my research that it's going to slow down. I have a pretty good outlook through 2030, and then we do look through 2035. I don't see it slowing down only because um, the technology that is encompassing all of AI close to AGI is at arm's length, and then that's from a digital side. There's many companies that are now talking about the physical side of AI, which would be now the more robotic side and the humanoids and such. And so I think that could be a secondary wave we see from a market standpoint. All of that has to be housed and powered, cooled, and secured. So,
Sure.
yeah, I don't know if that's good news or bad news to who asked it, but
Thank you. Beth, are you on the right flower slide?
I'm on the right flower
All right,
side. So
fantastic.
sorry, you guys. Technology. Um, the I wanted to show this because just to compare it. So again, this is what we've inherited. The Blackland Prairie, where this data center is going to go up, or a few data centers are going to, many are going up actually. This is what it used to look like and what it can look like. It's in terms of biodiversity, it's second only to the Amazon rainforest. So the potential for restoration is enormous, and we should just remember that. This is a snapshot from Project Drawdown, which is just talking about if we move from, because Texas is probably always going to be cattle land, but can we move to silvopasturing? And many of you are familiar with the concept of silvopasturing. So can we be doing that at the same time? The data center sites that we're talking about are in the thousands of acres, but the physical side of the data center will only be a couple hundred acres. So what can we be doing in partnership with the landowners, actually multiple landowners, or those who hold conservation easements nearby, to actually be actively restoring that land? The way that we're going to do that is actually through water capture. For whatever reason, most data center companies don't capture their rooftop water. We've heard a lot about the pushback on the waterfront specifically. Our chillers don't use any water. Actually, very like one time you fill it and then that's it. So it's an important distinction, but the question is, how do you actually move to water positive? And can you get that? Really, it's tens of millions of gallons a year that just come off the roof. Right now, most data centers just shed that water because it's like having a toaster next to your sink. Like nobody wants to deal with electricity and water at the same time. So they try to get it as far away from the data center as possible. What we're saying is we'll capture it and we'll use it, and we'll use it for land restoration, specifically in the neighboring property, or we can actually move it through trucks and other forms to for other landowners nearby. This is what our chillers look like. Like I said, they're considered waterless. I think technically it's a few gal like as with it's a glycol water mix. So what happens is you have to top it off, I think, every couple months, but it's pretty minimal. So it's not evaporative cooling the way that most work. We're down to a PUE of 1.15, so under the 1.2 that Anthony was talking about, which is again phenomenal. And we will have to have other engineers come in and talk about how they've achieved that. This is a rendering of what we're aiming our site to look like. So it'll have constructed wetland next to the data center so all data centers have what are called detention ponds, and you have to have a detention pond because sometimes data centers catch fire, which is super fun. Hopefully very few of them are going to continue to do that. But in the early days of data centers, that was a real concern. It was driving cost up for a community. So you have to have a detention pond. Most of the time they're just like chlorinated little ponds that are next to it. But we thought it's an opportunity for biodiversity. It's an opportunity for life. So we'll have a 6-acre constructed wetland next to our data center, which will capture that rainwater in addition to cisterns that will also capture that rooftop water. In Central Texas, like I said, that could be between 30 and 35 million gallons a year just off of that. There's other atmospheric water generation that we're going to be doing as well through our turbines. And then we'll be partnering with different land-based organizations to do reconstructed woodlands and also regenerative agriculture right next door. The second part of the design assignment is waste equals food. Really briefly, I like showing this picture because waste can be lots of things. So for those of you who don't know, this is a picture of what the Sahara Desert looks like when the diatomaceous earth that is embedded in the sand flows across the Atlantic. Every year actually probably a couple times a year, when Chad had a mega lake, 7 million acre lake, it dried up over, thousands of years ago at this point. But the diatoms that lived in that lake ground up. That diatomaceous earth gets floated to the top during a storm. And when the winds blow, it blows all the way across in the form of dust. And this is a picture from a NASA satellite, the Calypso, that has captured what that dust looks like when it moves across the Atlantic and it lands in the Amazon. That phosphorus keeps the Amazon alive. It doesn't have a source of phosphorus without it. So that's a waste stream, quote unquote, from one part of the world that makes its way for free all the way over, delivering essentially free fertilizer to another part, which is the lungs of the planet. That's a concept of cycles and systems that we have the ability to think about. Heat is one of those issues. Anthony raised it as well. We have to really begin to mitigate it. It should be as big a topic as water, frankly. It is an alarming amount of heat that's coming off of data centers, and it has to be accounted for. So whether that ends up being absorption chillers, and which we're also going to be using as well, there's still a lot of heat. I'm not a fan of what's called free cooling, because the question would be free for who? If you put data centers in cold environments, from a global warming perspective, that just seems like a very questionable idea. Instead, what we're seeing is a lot of district heating in Europe. So being able to partner with district heating systems that are already in place from major utility players is a really good application. Sometimes that district heat goes to heating swimming pools like it did for the Olympics in Paris. It's also being used in colder climates to move heat and CO2 into greenhouses for year-round food production. One of the applications that we're thinking about is asking some companies to co-locate on our gigawatt campus sites. So the paper industry, for instance, uses a tremendous amount of heat because it's constantly drying. It's drying cellulose, it's drying pulp. So how do we actually think beyond our sector and work with neighboring sectors who have similar demands? So we can provide a very subsidized cost of free resource to a second industry. Another one of my favorite applications that we're talking to is about the sort of biphasic material molten salt. So when salt heats up to a certain degree, it actually becomes a liquid. It stores that heat. You can move it in the form of a battery almost to another place that actually needs heat. So you're not stuck, if you can't have a district heating system that's already in place from an infrastructure perspective, you heat up big blocks of essentially molten salt and watch that liquid be transported to a place of need. The other thing that we're doing on site is there's a lot of invasive species and a lot of woody material. So we're going to be preheating that wood into biochar. So we'll still need to actually high heat the biochar itself, which we're going to try to also do with a small amount of incremental heat exchange. But we can dry out a lot of the woody waste first so that the flashing that happens to create biochar, which is what we will need to make the regenerative soil possible. Biochar is a phenomenon. It has like a lot of complex structures where the niches will retain extra enzymatic life and also water. So we really want biochar on the land, and it's going to take a lot of it. So using the waste heat to create biochar is a really obvious application. But maybe one of the things I'm most excited about is as we look at global water scarcity, there's an opportunity to think about using the waste heat to run desalination processes, whether of contaminated water, brackish water, potentially even seawater for some of those regional applications as well. We're partnering with a couple universities around brine valorization because when you desalinate water, you are always left with brine, which can be an environmental hazard. So how do we actually valorize that waste stream, that brine, into something that's useful? This is very simply what the process looks like. It's any other sort of distillery process. We can replace that Bunsen burner with the waste heat coming off of our generators. Specifically, we also have heat coming off of our chillers, but the heat coming off the generators is much hotter, so it's more usable heat. The other waste stream that we're looking at is Endeavour is kind of interesting because we don't just do data centers, we do all of the aspects that go into the digital infrastructure. And so replacing copper has become really important. And the way that we're going to replace copper is with carbon nanotubes so that we won't have to go through the extractive mining process. One of the companies that we partnered with is called Trim Tabs. Actually, I think we've acquired them as a company, so it's not just a partnership. Trim Tabs can make carbon nanotubes to replace copper for transmission lines and for thermal heat moving by using styrofoam as its feedstock, which is phenomenal because styrofoam is an interesting one from a recycling perspective. So again, if you start to open the aperture to more than just your sector for optimization, you can actually start to see what are the other waste streams in the region that you can actually start to use to change the very elements of what you need. The last thing I wanted to talk about is see that segment right there called novel entities. That's plastic, that's PFAS, that's glyphosate. Those are all of the things that biological life does not recognize. And it is off the charts in terms of the problems of planetary boundaries of what we've transgressed so far. Microplastics, the news on microplastics only gets worse and worse, by the way. Most of you know this, but it's now we've found that as microplastics degrade, they become receptor sites for heavy metals. So that's explaining a lot of the heavy metal content in our bodies because we have ingested so many microplastics as well. It is the root of many of the other sources of the transgression of the planetary boundary lines. So by going after plastic or oil and gas plastic specifically, not bioplastics, but going after those, we can actually disproportionately impact or improve the other parts of the planetary boundary paradigm. This is it's kind of a fuzzy one, but this is another product that we have. It's called packed graphite. It basically takes natural gas or methane, cracks it through a pyrolysis process, pulls off the hydrogen, and drops out carbon, drops out graphite. That graphite can then be used for material production, and the hydrogen can actually power the turbines that we use. That's going to be the cleanest way that we can both power the data centers, but also be creating a byproduct that can actually be used for new material generation. Graphene is not, we're not going to be able to get graphene out of the gate. Graphene's really hard to make, by the way. Much higher heat, different surface area, but we can actually get to different levels of graphite that have other functional properties. And so we have a team of chemists that are working on that problem at the moment. But the reason why it's relevant is because if you ask me and a bunch of other people that are deep in the environmental movement, we will all sort of agree that the future is biodegradable and that we have to be thinking about this from what is the asset that we are creating with our material stream. If you take so this is a company called Mango Materials. It's been around for a long time. They're taking from the methane off of sewage plants and actually turning it into a bioplastic. But you can change that bioplastic into new and greater functional sort of materials that replace traditional plastic by melding it with graphite that comes off of our system or other systems. So we're starting to open up a new materials palette through these waste streams that have not been previously tapped before. So now imagine if you can actually mitigate the methane that's coming off the sewage plants and the fuel source that's going into data centers, marry those at the same time and get a new material class. That's the new systems level view that we're really talking about. This is Amphotex, another example. To me, once you have a new materials palette, you can marry it with the biological designs that have been existing, for millennia into new structural properties. So this is basically looking at the springtail and how it supports water. So imagine if you don't have to use the perfluorinated chemicals that typically go into waterproofing material, but instead you can use structure. And now you have this sort of graphite and biomaterial base that you can manipulate into new design structures based upon how nature's designs work, that whole catalog that tells us what we really should be doing. You can make really high functional materials. The last thing I'll say is just a reminder, all of this adds up to that there's a library, a virtual library of what we should be designing the world to look like that is based upon time-tested design. That is, I struggle with AI, as I think we probably all do, because we don't really know what's ahead for us for the future of work, the future of social safety. I think these are all really important ethical questions that we have to grapple with, and we should grapple with them openly and together. But one thing I feel really strongly about is that if AI has some redeeming qualities, which we all use it, so I'm going to say that it does, this is looking at a much more readily available way to tap into nature's genius and be able to marry those designs to new materials that are possible. That is like the exciting moment that I think we're in. So my hope is that we will remember like the number one rule, which is that life creates the conditions conducive to life. So everything that we do as humans that we are designing, we have to remember this number one rule. Did the thing that I make more life possible? And if the answer is yes, then we're right on track. And if the answer is no, then we have more design work to do. So that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Beth. That was terrific. Really interesting to see where we could be headed and what the future of all of this energy generation could take us. We do have a few questions. Initially, we have one for Anthony. Awesome work JCI has going on. Thanks for sharing. Can you speak to how well brands like Amazon, AWS, and the big model providers are prioritizing sustainability in their data center strategies? What portion of data center projects do you estimate are taking an intentionally sustainable approach? This could be for both of you, actually.
Yeah, that's a great question. So as we work with a lot of the largest hyperscalers worldwide, it's becoming more and more of a priority. So a large percentage of new builds have to be have a sustainability aspect to it. And the reason for this is it's now headline news everywhere you look. There's compliance, especially in EMEA. There's a lot of compliance and regulations. There's water use, electrical use. There's grid constraints. So everything now needs to be taken into consideration. So the only way to actually build is to fall within a lot of the compliances. And it's funny. I was just reading earlier this morning that there's a data center going in Tennessee, and that the community is looking to appeal it in some way. And so we're getting a lot of community pushback. And so our sustainability goals in a design and build have to come to fruition if it's going to be built. So it actually gives back to the community as opposed to take back.
Great. Beth, did you have anything to say for that question?
I would look, a lot of the companies are beginning to roll back some of their climate commitments, their carbon commitments, and I think that that's a reflection of the times. I'm hoping that there's still a lot of people who care deeply about sustainability in each of those companies, and I know that for a fact that there are. And so I think it's a moment when I'm so proud of the people who stand up and protest data centers, because it gives people like Anthony and I an opportunity to really push harder for sustainability initiatives. And the tide will turn. Like, as a species, we're the ask for forgiveness instead of permission kind of a species. We're about to ask for a lot of forgiveness, and so I think that we're seeing that the pendulum will shift. So we're just trying to get ahead of that.
Okay. And the interest in sustainability and any requirements have to differ from state to state, right? Since there are no federal regulations, at least in the US. So it depends on where you're building, right? Okay. Another question, is there a model of a data center that is subterranean in whole or partially to mitigate excess heat and sound?
I don't know if Anthony knows about any, but I don't. We've heard Microsoft had an ocean, like a submarine. That was one. And
Yeah.
I've seen other companies that are now putting their data centers onto ships and using the free cooling of running that ocean water. Again, like my question is always like free to who? That heat goes somewhere. And so I think subterranean would be interesting. I don't know. I don't know any specific examples of one.
Okay.
Yeah, same here. I know of a lot of exploratory ideas for it, but I don't know of any ones that have come to fruition, at least in the size and magnitude that would matter.
Okay. All right. Well, interesting to know they're being thought about.
I will say something to just follow up on Anthony's point.
Yeah.
I think, and the training centers, these gigawatt scale centers, there's a difference of opinion here. Some people believe that training centers will continue to be needed in massive scale, and some people are like, inference is the future, smaller data centers are the future. There's a group that's trying to put like mini data centers into residential neighborhoods attached to people's houses,
Yes.
and thinking about a really distributed model, which is a nature-inspired design concept of decentralization. I wonder, I don't know how I feel about them attached to people's homes. I think there's a lot of safety concerns we'd have to tackle first, but I do think that smaller data centers will for sure rise, and that those can, from a sustainability perspective, those are way easier to manage and achieve.
And
And we're
hopefully,
starting to see that with modularization and edge computing
That's right.
and such. So Beth, you alluded to like the community aspect to it, where a data center would fuel community now. And I think those are really interesting concepts to start thinking about.
thank you both. Here's one from Crystal Reyes, Engelbrecht. For those of us involved in construction rather than ownership, where do you see the greatest opportunity to move the industry forward? Are there examples where contractors have successfully influenced data center projects to improve biodiversity, resource stewardship, or community outcomes despite not being the decision makers?
Beth, you're probably closer to
Yeah,
that,
I
I
can
think.
speak to that
Yeah.
because we engage third-party contractors
Mhm.
all the time. It's such a funny thing. They are under such pressure for speed, and speed usually doesn't mean like, yeah, let me try something new. Let's work on the biodiversity footprint of this place. Like that conversation is hard. I mean, just the amount of hoops we are jumping through to get water capture off of a roof, which is not difficult from a residential perspective, but crazy difficult from a data center perspective. I think that I think you're in a great position for advocacy. And I think that oftentimes if you can point to, and this is the value of USGBC and well in general, is like if we can point to case studies like we did this here and it works. And don't worry, the risk mitigation is possible. The liability is not a big deal. I think that that's where you have an advocacy role to play.
Thank you. Here's a question for Anthony from one of our staff, Mona Duff. Is there much retrofitting of existing data centers from air to water cooling happening, or is the water cooling focus on new build data centers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I kind of look at that as two separate questions. One is that switch from air cooled to liquid cooled, and absolutely that's happening. I don't know of any data centers that like are 100% liquid cooled. It's more of like a hybrid program, and some of them are moving towards a certain percentage of it, depending on if it's AI training or inference and what those kilowatt racks are really. And we have like maximums per kilowatt rack based on like the technology of air cooled, liquid cooled, and then single phase, two phase, or immersion. So, but the second portion of the question, which is in retrofits, we see that actually being an enormous next wave for us. And the reason for that is because you already have the site, you already have the build, you already have access to power, which is really the hardest part. And so by retrofitting a building, a data center to not just air to liquid, but just in general with technology, because they're utilizing technology at a rate that a normal building 60% faster than a normal building would as well. So that's something to consider also. So yes, two-pronged approach. We see a lot moving from air to liquid and a hybrid program. And then retrofits we're already starting to see from buildings that were built 10 years ago. And then now the rise we're going to start to see in about 1.5 to 2 years really start to take off.
Fantastic. Here's another question from one of our staff, Claire Epke. This may have changed a bit with different liquids being used, but years ago, the byproduct of the cooling elements was 86-degree clean water. This is perfect for hydroponic food growth. Is this another type of coupling of adjacent industries being explored?
Yeah, I love that point. There's so much water potential that can come off of the process for just simply mostly through condensation is the easiest way to think about it. So I love that. This is for everybody who's on this call today. Like that's the design assignment is start to think about what co-products are available and how, and it's going to take design minds. It's going to take creativity to think about it, and frankly, and to share those case studies with one another. But I love that idea. It's a great one.
I have a question, Beth, for you. You showed a rendering that was really very lovely of what data centers could look like and all of the greenery around them and a pond. How long would it take? And you had just talked about Texas and showed us how arid that land was. I mean, how long would a development like that take to grow?
I think it's like how long does it take a tree to grow? Like that's the short answer. But it's why being water positive, and if we do this well, we'll be the first water positive campus at gigawatt scale in the U.S. So, and like 1,000 things can go wrong between now and then. So I'm not trying to be naive about it, but that's the plan, and
So that rendering is actually, I mean, that's going to happen.
that's
That's
the
not a
plan.
fantasy.
That is
Okay.
literally the layout. And
Okay.
so we break ground in a couple of months actually. And so we'll see, and it'll be ugly for a minute, and
Right.
then hopefully but that, and the other thing I want to clarify is that has to be in partnership with the landowner.
Mhm.
So the footprint is pretty small, like I said. So let's say it's a 2,700 acre parcel. We're going to use 300 of it for the data center site. The rest is in partnership.
Yeah. I feel like we just have a few minutes left. I feel like I haven't heard a lot of these stories. I haven't read about them in the media. I haven't heard about them in more, say, specialized media. Um, how are you trying to get your stories out to let people know this is not all doom and gloom and that there's actually a lot of possibility in what we're facing right now?
Well, certainly forums like this, Susan,
Yeah.
it always helps to share this news. We have an entire PR and comms department that sources, and we do a lot of data centers as good neighbor talk,
Mhm.
where we're able to actually share the good news of sustainability and the steps we're taking and even have taken, from power and water, carbon, sound, and a lot of it is new information to people. And so
Yeah.
just using these forums and the media opportunities to be able to share what Johnson Controls is doing and how sustainability is the arc of our build and design for
Mhm.
these for the future.
And do you think do things as small as say town halls in places where you're planning to site?
We do, yes, yeah, we absolutely do. Sometimes the data center owners will do that as well,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
depending on if they have sourced their vendors and contractors, we could be side by side with them. And then
Yeah.
if not, sometimes the data center owners will do that as they're already finding a site selection. We'll be going out and starting to share that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add that it's Endeavour is the parent company, by the way. I think I should have explained that. Edge data centers, edge infrastructure provides the equipment. Edge data centers does the build. We have to show up at those town meetings.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Amazing. This has been so edifying. Really so much information to absorb and take in here. We've had a few people ask if we will be sharing a recording of this. We have recorded it, and we will certainly look into sharing it with all of you. So thank you both so much. This has been a terrific session, and I really appreciate both of you joining us.
Thanks for having
Thank,
us on,
yeah,
Susan.
thank you for having us.
So long. Thank you.
Yep.